Welcome back to Cognitive Processes. In this lecture, I'd like to talk a little bit about language and how language is so important to our understanding of cognition. So first of all, I'm sure you know, language is present in all cultures and it's essential for knowledge, but it's also essential for the culture that we experience. So let's talk a little bit about the structure of language. So first of all, there are different components to our language. There are the sounds of language, that's our phonemes. So the term phonemes refers to the sounds of our language. And then there are the meaningful units, and they are morphemes. The morphemes are the small meaningful units of language. We have syntax, which are the rules of putting sentences together. We have semantics, the rules for associating meaning with sentences, and you've remember the terminology semantic memory. So coming back to that terminology again. And then we have pragmatics, or the social assumptions of language. So a little bit of terminology to get us started. So think about a simple English sentence. So say the sentence is the strangers talk to the players. You have phrases in the sentence like the strangers and talk to players, but then you also have all the individual words. But then also you have the morphemes. So strangers, for example, has strange, and s in that word. So there's little units of meaning embedded into words. And sometimes words are just one morpheme like the, but sometimes words contain multiple morphemes. And then you have the phonemes, the sounds that composed up to the morphemes. And this is a hierarchical structure. Each level is composed of the other components below it. And so when you start breaking it down, you start realizing, oh, there's a lot of complexity, even in the most simple of sentences. So just a little bit more about phonemes, because sometimes it's a little bit difficult to understand what we're talking about in phonemes. You have a symbol, a letter like P, and you have phonemes like the P and pat or the P and apple. They sound a little different, but you have those phonemes embedded into the words. And then you have letters that can be indicating different phonemes. Let's go to the bottom of the list here and look at U. So you have the U sound in boot, but you also have the U sound in foot, right? Those are different sounds, and they actually aren't tied to the letter O, they're tied to the U. So, there's where some of the complexity comes in. Phonemes are referring to the sounds, not exactly the letter of the alphabet. So when we are talking in language, we're using all kinds of structures in our mouth, in our throat. The modulation of air is through our mouth and our nose. And the production of phonemes relies on all of these structures. Our vocal cords, our oral cavity, our tongue, our soft palate, all of these different areas are important in developing the production of phonemes. And we actually have different sounds in different languages that if you've practiced them, you can produce them. But if you've never been exposed to them in a critical window, you might not actually produce them as an adult. So we'll talk about that in a little bit. So a little bit about phonology. So there's a voicing when you are communicating. That's when vocal cords vibrate. Think about Z or D or B or V. If you just put your hand on your neck and you make those sounds like Z, you can hear the vibration, you can feel it with your hand. So sometimes when you voice, you make the vibrations, and with others, you do not. Like put your hand on your neck now and say S. You don't really feel much vibration, do you? But you do if you say Z. So also then there's the manner of production, whether the air is fully stopped or not, or merely restricted. So think about B or S. The air is fully stopped for the B, the S, not so much. And then the place of articulation, where in the mouth the air is restricted. Think about closing your lips when you say the letter B or P. You have to close the lips to make those sounds. The top of the teeth have to be against the bottom lip for V or F. And then the tongue has to be behind the upper teeth to make D or T or Z. So it's really interesting how your mouth is working to make all these complex things. Okay, what about sentence parsing? So prosody refers to the pattern of pauses and pitch changes that characterize speech production, and it's used for a couple of different reasons. It emphasizes elements of a sentence. You probably notice this when I give a lecture. Like if I really want you to remember something specific on a slide, I will use a pitch change or I'll pause right before saying something or after saying something so that I'm really trying to grab your attention. When you have that prosody, you highlight these sentences' intended structure, and you signal the difference between a question and an assertion. So if you want to say a question, you can say the exact same words, but you can say it as a question, or you can just say it as a question. If you've ever taken a speech class, they spend a lot of time talking about like improving your prosody and different techniques to change how you say things so that you can grab your audience's attention or at least keep them interested, right? What about sentence parsing? Pragmatics is the knowledge about how language is ordinarily used. So this is where when someone learns a new language, they have a lot of trouble getting that aspect of the language. They can learn the words sometimes by just practicing words going with certain things, but the nuances of language are tricky. So if I could show you this picture of all these dogs and I say, what happened to the roast beef? Like you automatically know what I'm sort of inferring to. Like, one of those little dogs maybe snatched that roast beef off the counter. And then if I say something, well, the dog sure does look happy, then you know for sure that the dog snatched the roast beef, even though I never said it. You know that he must have eaten it, but I never said that. And that's where the tricky part of language is when someone's learning a new language is, how do you teach people how to convey this sort of information? So this leads to us to the next statement that, boy, it's amazing how easily children learn language. Even with not much exposure, they just have a biological predisposition to learn it so easily. They must have a biological mechanism because if you think about the complexity of language, already we've talked about so much about language that is so complex, they don't have any trouble learning it. So they must have a biological mechanism that predisposes them to learn it. Keep in mind, this is separate from reading. So learning to speak a language and reading are separate issues. Reading is a different story. There's a lot of intentional learning that has to happen for reading that does not occur for language. So how do we know there's biological roots of language? Well, obviously kids learn it so easily. We don't even have to really teach them all that much, and they will be fluent speakers without any intervention on our part. Also, it's interesting to look at developmental disorders characterized by specific language impairments. A lot of times children will have normal intelligence, normal muscle movement, but they have difficulty learning and using language, suggesting that in certain cases, there is evidence that something went a little awry, and so we must have a specialized mechanism for language learning. Also, you can study language in children and you see these interesting over-regularizations that they are learning as they're learning to speak. So it's very common for little children when they're learning to speak that they'll say things like, yesterday I thinked. So they're learning that the ed is used in sentences and they're overusing it in cases where it's not appropriate, but they're learning the language rules. And do we teach them these rules? No, of course not, right? Like they're just picking it up so easily just by being around other people talking to them. So learning of information present in the environment is also critical to language acquisition. Children as young as 8 months are sensitive to the statistical regularities in the language that they hear, as shown in studies employing nonsense syllable streams. So what do I mean by that? Like you can have a little baby, they're 8 months old, so they're not even walking yet. Put them in the lab and let them listen to sounds. and let them listen to sounds like, the B sound over and over again. B, 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 B. And, when you first hear a sound, the baby will turn and look, but then they get distracted and bored. But if you change the sound slightly to T or another sound that's similar, like they will turn and look again. And so they are picking up on what is happening and when there's changes, even though they are well ahead of when they would be speaking. So they're just by being in the environment, they're learning these statistical regularities in language and picking up on it. There is a limit in this biological preparation for language. I'm sure you probably heard about this in even your introduction to psychology class. You have children who were not exposed to language, like so there were various like case studies of children who got lost in the woods and they actually survived because they went into a pack of wolves and lived with the wolves and they actually didn't perish in that experience. And so they were alive and doing okay, but they couldn't learn language because they hadn't been exposed to any language. So even if there was extensive rehabilitation, they seem to have missed that critical window of when language was being acquired, and so they never could acquire that language. Now, in these cases, of course, you also have like other things going on that makes it very difficult for these children. But it does suggest that there is probably a critical window where you need to learn something, and we know that from other studies. Like, for example, little kids can pick up on the phonemes in another language very easily up to a couple of, several years of age, but after a certain period of time, then they can't hear those phonemes if they're exposed to them. So there are certain phonemes in other languages that I wouldn't be able to even hear, but a small child can easily hear them and then acquire them. So what's the difference between the terms phonology and orthography? So phonology is the sequence of phonemes that make up a word, where orthography is how the word is spelled if the person is literate. So remember how I talked about the difference that exposing kids to language is just something they learn by osmosis, just being around it, they will pick it up. The reading and spelling aspect of things is different. Children need intentional instruction to learn these things. They are not going to learn them just by osmosis. In speech, we have pragmatics, which are the speech acts. Again, think about examples and then these will make sense. So if I say to you, it's cold today, then I'm making an assertive. If I say, open the window, I'm making a directive, telling you to do something. If I say, I promise to study tonight, then that's a commissive. If I say, I thank you for helping me, that's an expressive. And if I say, you're fired, that's a declaration. So when we incorporate pragmatics into our speech, we're giving information to the other person about just stating something or telling them to do something or other things that are really important information for communication. Understanding speech, perceiving speech. Well, if you think about it, it's really difficult, isn't it? Yeah, but part of it is the problem of speech is just continuous. We don't often pause between words. If you're trying to learn a new language, you understand how difficult this is. You can learn all the individual vocabulary of a new language, but then once it all strings together, it gets all so confusing, and then you don't partially hear all words clearly, and so it is challenging. The second problem is any phoneme sound will sound different depending on the context in which it appears. So again, you have another problem. So how is language constructed in that perception? How does that occur? So we've talked a lot about vision in this course. And in speech, we do not only rely on the stimuli we receive, we supplement this with input from prior knowledge about words and context. And that is very much like what we've seen before in this course, that we don't operate in this little bubble. We use information that makes sense to help us process information, and it's no different with speech. So think about the phonemic restoration effect. And that's been shown in studies where we hear phonemes that aren't actually present in the stimulus. And we do that based on contextual information, the context in which it occurs. So if I have a sentence like the state governors met with their retrospective legislatures convening in the capital city, and if I drop the S sound, or if the S sound is blocked by like a beep or a burst of noise or something like that, even though I didn't say it or that information didn't reach your ears, you fill it in. And in fact, you would never even notice that the S was missing, right? That's a phonemic restoration effect. We fill in information based on what makes sense. And you've seen this many times before in this course. So, um, going back to the 1960s, they did these studies where they just spliced out words from conversations, tape recorded conversations, and when individuals had information blocked, if the contextual information, the context made it easy to identify, then they had no problem. But if there was no context, they couldn't do it. Didn't make sense. So if you have a sentence like, it was found that the eel was on the axle, and you replace the part of the word eel with a cough sound or a beep or anything like that, you just fill it in with wheel or any other contextual information that makes sense in the sentence. And so you've seen this again and again, right? Our brain, our body is not going to get all the complete information it needs every single moment in time. So our brain fills in the missing information to help us make sense of the world. And you can even make speech errors. We do this all the time. You've probably seen this in my lectures where I said something incorrect, and you just correct it in your mind. So if Sue said that she keeps food in her vest instead of her desk, we wouldn't hear vesk. Even if she mispronounced it, you might not even catch that she said the wrong letter and not say desk. So we make errors involving sound all the time, and those errors involve meaning. But we almost never make errors that involve both sound and meaning. So, we'll mispronounce things, we'll say the wrong word, well, the listener, either if they do hear it, they still understand what you're talking about. Or if they don't hear it, they just replace it in their mind with something that actually makes sense. So when we test people in the lab and ask them about comprehending sentences, what researchers have found is that we store the gist of information, not the exact details. So if you've got something ambiguous going on in the text, you might be able to initially access both meanings, like the actual meaning and then the ambiguous thing, but we quickly will discard the incorrect meaning. And if you ask the person about it later, they'll just fill in with what makes sense, even if it's not actually the correct information. Now, a little bit more about reading. As you know, I talked about the fact that reading is a little bit more difficult for kids to learn. That's why we spend a lot of time with reading instruction in school, but we don't do any instruction on speech all that much because kids pick it up so fairly automatically. So when you're doing reading, what are you doing? Well, you're fixating when you read on the meaningful words. So you look at eye fixation data studies and you look at where the eyes are fixating, where the pupil is going. It doesn't smoothly go across the text. It actually, you'll have more fixation on the meaning words and spend less time on words that aren't giving you as much information, that are more the function words, the, are, and, that kind of thing. We process text by propositions or units of meaning, and then we will separate sentences into given and new information. This strategy is going to work best when the given information is still in memory. So when you ask people to read things, they are not processing word by word. What they are doing is they're reading a sentence and they're like, okay, what's the take-home message here? And then if you ask them about the take-home message, they're pretty good at answering that. But if you were to ask them specific details about the sentence, they'd have a really hard time doing that because you're just getting the gist of the sentence. So look at this example of an ambiguous story. If the balloons pop, the sound wouldn't be able to carry since everything would be too far away from the correct floor. A closed window would also prevent the sound from carrying since most buildings tend to be well insulated. Since the whole operation depends on a steady flow of electricity, a break in the middle of the wire would also cause problems. Of course, the fellow could shout, but the human voice is not loud enough to carry that far. An additional problem is that the string could break on the instrument. Then there would be no accompaniment to the message. It is clear that the best situation would involve less distance. Then there would be fewer potential problems. With face-to-face contact, the least number of things could go wrong. So this is a passage from a Bransford and Johnson study, and as you can tell, it's an ambiguous passage. I read it to you. You probably have no idea what is going on. But if I showed you a picture, then even though the picture is crazy of a interesting sort of thing, now doesn't this make sense? The passage makes sense when you look at the picture. So if you had that contextual information before I read you that little passage, then you would know exactly what is going on. This tells you again, and has been shown in many studies, that the context is so important. When you give people information in isolation, then they really struggle with interpreting the information. But if you give the information in context, then people do quite well. So, do you want to be better at conversation? How would you do that? Well, a couple of different things you can think about. If you think, oh, I'm a great conversationalist, well, terrific, I'm glad. But if you sometimes struggle with it, then think about a couple of these things. First of all, quantity. Make sure when you contribute in a conversation, make sure it's just as informative as it needs to be. Maybe not more or less. So think about sometimes people, I'm sure you've had this example where you've talked to someone and they're just giving you all kinds of random crazy details and you're like, what is the point of this? And then you lose track of what they're trying to say because they're just telling you all kinds of things that are not really central. But if you talk too little, then you're not conversing with someone as well. So you want to find that sort of like sweet spot middle ground in terms of how much quantity. Quality, be truthful, or at least make it clear when you're being sarcastic. Give quality information to people as opposed to, dancing around issues or, if you're joking around, make sure the other person knows that you're doing that. Relation, be relevant, be interesting and helpful. And then manner, be clear, avoid ambiguity, and be brief. A lot of times, say in the workplace, you want to think about these 4 things when you're contributing, like in a meeting. People will really value your contributions if you give them the right amount of information, that it's quality information, that it's relevant information, and then you do it in a manner that is very clear. And the best way to see that is, do a recorded presentation and see what you look like. As part of this course, you're going to do that as one of your assignments. And I think that's really valuable information because when you watch yourself, I know it's sometimes cringeworthy to watch yourself, but when you watch yourself, that's the only way that you can see, am I being a clear communicator or do I need to work on this a little bit? Okay, a little bit about connecting the language to cognition. So the modularity hypothesis is that language is domain specific. It operates with certain kinds of input and not others. And language is informationally encapsulated. It operates independently of your beliefs and knowledge. So let's think about this in terms of how does our thinking connect to language? Well, there's the Whorfian hypothesis, and the idea behind this is that the language that you speak determines thought. So how do we know that? Well, we have studies that have looked at different languages, and in different languages, there are differing numbers of words to cover concepts. So you can look at one language, and it might have a lot of different words that describe colors, and then other languages that are, less words. This impacts how an individual perceives and remembers colors. And how you talk about these things will change your cognition. But you also know this probably from personal experience. How you talk about something, including talking to yourself about something, will determine how you think about it. This is why journaling can be such an important thing to do for personal growth, because once you get it out in language, once you write out and talk to yourself about something, then directions become clear, or things you want to change about yourself become clear. So if you want to improve your life, then think about languaging determining thought. How can you use that information to maybe improve your thinking in whatever you want to do in terms of better thinking? Okay, so little neuropsychological findings about this topic, as you know, from the brain chapter. We have Broca's area and Wernicke's area. It's good to remind you about those two areas. If you have damage in the Broca's area, then you're going to have a patient who has difficulties producing spoken language. That's often called the expressive aphasia. If you see that in a patient, they will understand language, but they can't produce it. If someone has damage in Wernicke's area, by contrast, then they will have difficulties in comprehending spoken language. They have a reception problem, a receptive aphasia. So they may have difficulties comprehending, but they can still produce language fluently. Tells you a lot about languages in the left hemisphere. And there are different components of language that are actually in different parts of the brain. So, quick review of this chapter. Language is structured on several levels. We talked about phonological, syntactic, semantic, and pragmatic. Second thing is people use different linguistic roles when they produce and comprehend language. Important context effects exist at many levels, from the perception of phonemes to the comprehension of stories. We saw that in different experiments. Language is cooperative, and even casual conversations have roles to help the participants understand each other. And language does not entirely determine how you think, but it certainly influences your thought process. So if you want to improve how you think about the world, then start with language. Start talking and start writing, and then you will be able to do that. And that's the end of this chapter.